Retrieving a map of the fortress from the remains of the dead, the kings and queens discussed a plan on how to execute their next move. They all discovered that the fortress held an array of underground tunnels and rooms the size of colosseums. They saw that right beneath them on the map was a large central room that held 3 separate doorways that led to different areas of the fortress underground. Now armed with this knowledge, the soldiers spent their final moments resting as the order was given to move out again. The underground entrance lay just beyond a large wooden door that, when pushed open, revealed a spiraling stone staircase that led down into the catacombs of hell. As the soldiers wandered down the stairs, the faint sound of torches cracking through the air could be heard, as the equal sound of weaponry tapping armor could also be heard accompanying the unionized march. After what felt like an eternal descent, eventually they come across a large open colosseum held up with titanic pillars of stone. In front of them were 3 large-sized doors made entirely from wood, with barriers on the lower half to allow for people to remove them and open the way. Exactly as the map foretold, the kings and queens then decided to split up the force amongst themselves, as they would each take a section of the paths that lay ahead of them. But, unbeknownst to them, a worse situation was soon to descend upon them. Scuttling and cackles could be heard coming from up high. However, when the soldiers looked upward, all they could see was a dark void. It was then that one soldier fired an arrow into the clouds of darkness. Many quiet, eerie seconds went by, until suddenly a corpse fell from the ceiling and splattered onto the floor, blood and guts flying from the smashed corpse. It was then that several blood-curdling screeches started descending from above them as more mangled and contorted soldiers began their attack upon the battalion. The ravaging creatures tore into the ranks of the battalion as several began falling and succumbing to the attack. It was a massacre. King Acarnus watched on in horror as his fellow soldiers were being gutted, decapitated, and contorted. However, the king had an ace up his sleeve. Feeling that his staff had regained its energy, he gave an almighty cast onto the ground. This released a wave of purifying light that spread throughout the Colosseum and burned away the creatures of the colony. Silence befell the Colosseum. The creatures started falling from the ceiling and slamming on the ground with a resounding splat, sending even more blood across the floor and on to the nearby soldiers. It seemed that all enemies had been banished, but this was still not the end yet. King Acarnus ordered a short rest period for the soldiers to rest and recuperate before they would head out again for the final time. Now it was time. The soldiers all banded together once more and were separated into 3 smaller forces. One force commanded by King Ivadon, the other by Queens Tassia and Eventide, and the last by King Acarnus himself. Acarnus headed toward the central door and pressed forward, no one knowing what horror could lay further beyond. As they continued to walk through the endless darkness, another gargantuan door lay in front of them. Strangely, however, this one had giant claw marks that stretched from top to bottom of the doorway. Taking note of this strange observation, they proceeded to heave the door open with all their strength and might. As they poured through the doorway, the room ahead of them was another large open space. This time, though, a giant pit lay before them. The pit went down for miles as the sea of darkness flooded the entire crevasse. But something far more horrifying stood at the apex of the abyss. There stood the very reason for the war's existence, the reason why so many had died in the pursuit of justice. However, he was not the same man he was before. This man was now consumed by the war. Much alike the soldiers, he had died many times over on the battlefield. But unlike them, his appearance was different. He was now the embodiment of stone. Magma flowed where blood once did, as it helped hold his body together. Not even the essence was enough to keep him alive now, as his body had undergone extreme change. This man was Nadir Helmfire. Staring down the king with an evil glare, he beckons toward him with mocking intent. He yells towards the king, calling him an old righteous man, forever marching the plains of this world in the pursuit of his victory. The king replies with a soft anger in his voice. He comments on Nadir's appearance, how he is now the embodiment of war and an amalgamation of the dead. Nadir laughs, for while he may have lost his mind and soul, what had Ekarnus gained? He had won the war at the cost of so many, a Pyrrhic victory that had forever scarred the land and its people. He remains silent as he struggles to find the words to respond to Nadir's mockery. That is when he snaps, yelling to Nadir that this is his final chance, surrender or face annihilation. Nadir responds that the euphoric sensation that his death would bring would be over in mere seconds, whether he did it here and now or with the kingdom watching. Nothing will ever bring back the soldiers and friends he had lost along the way. How was he to justify the losses to the grieving mother crying over the grave of their beloved child? Ekarnus falls into a shell of silence, as it is then that Nadir reveals he never intended to win the war. He had purposefully dragged it out over these long, bloody years, orchestrated every battle to ensure the largest number of dead possible. A song whose vocals are sang with the screams of the dead. Nadir had no intention to kill the king either. He would have gladly let him and Eventide live. All he cared about was that both of them had lost the will and power to be king and queen. The room falls silent as Nadir finishes his speech, everyone feeling the impact of his words. None more, however, than the king, as in that very moment the world around him had crumbled down. His hands bore so much blood. In the end, everyone suffers all the same in war. But before anyone could speak again, Nadir fell to the ground as he began to writhe in agony. But he was not wailing in pain. Instead, it was a horrific concoction of laughter, as that laughter turned into growls of discomfort, as everyone began watching on in horror as Nadir's body started to grow and contort into a horrific mass, watching as the slate of stone fell from his body to reveal the magma beneath, as before they knew it, Nadir had become a gargantuan monster of untold proportions. Staring down at the enemy, a wicked grin grows on his face as lava falls from his gaping maw, as he then points toward Ekarnus to proclaim that this battle will be his last as king. For from this, his people will revolt and demolish the eyesore that is their castle. But this did not faze the forces of harmony, for just as Ekarnus loses all hope, he turns to see his soldiers raising their fists and weapons alike high into the air and proclaiming that this is victory or death. It seemed Nadir had underestimated the will of the people, as when Ekarnus too raised his staff into the air, the soldiers let their voices of freedom be heard, as the chasm filled with their war cry. Echarnus pointed his staff towards the nightmarish Nadir, as his soldiers all charged into the beast. The fight for fate of all those in the kingdom now rests upon their sword and shield. In the beginning, Nadir made short work of many of the soldiers, crushing many beneath his feet, slamming them against the walls and even picking a few of them up and tearing their bodies apart with his bare hands. But Nadir had not expected the sheer number of soldiers before him, as he had hoped by now they would have given up in hope or perhaps switched sides and joined his renegade. But alas, they were bound in unison as many began to strike Nadir, and while these wounds were negligible, in the long run they would lead to unexpected ruptures in his body, as though he had transformed into a monstrous-like being. He still possessed organs and blood vessels that his weary, war-ridden body desperately needed to stay alive. As the soldiers launched their spears, fired volleys of arrows, and hurled many explosive weaponry to strike him where it hurt. Echarnus then leapt into the fray, using all of his fury he had kept locked inside, and unleashing it upon his nemesis, as Nadir watched on, cackling to himself as it seemed he had finally broken the king, who was now open in all his truth for all to see. Suddenly, Nadir begins to strike his fists against the walls of the underground, and punching the ground above him in an attempt to cause a cave-in, as large chunks of rock and debris began falling to the ground. In great haste, Echarnus cast his staff to force the door wide open, as he commanded everyone to retreat to the surface. As they retreated, they found themselves regrouping with the other forces, who too had felt the mass collapse that was imminent. Together, they made a mad dash for the exit, as the falling rocks drew ever closer. Finally, they had found the exit, and when they did, in an ironic twist of fate, that was when the entire fortress had collapsed, and while the vast majority were clear from the wreckage, many were unlucky and lost their lives in the collapse. The air became intoxicated with ash and smoke resulting from the ensuing calamity, making it almost impossible to breathe as everyone wandered aimlessly through the haze of the battlefield. But the madness was far from over, as before they knew it, the ground around them began to shake violently, as it seemed the very ground beneath them was being torn apart like paper, to reveal the mad Titan himself. It appears he had survived the cave-in, as he climbed his way from the debris to tower over the soldiers. Letting loose a cry, he grew ever more insane as it seemed any of his attempts to destroy them were outwitted by sheer luck. But he was through with this. Here would be where he made his final stand, and where he would see the fall of Echarnus. Towering, thundering, and striking the ground around him, he let madness consume him, as it seemed all his attacks were more erratic than coordinated. And while many had fallen to these violent, unpredictable attacks, in the end, the united army banded together to unleash their arsenal of vim and vigour upon the Titan, as in the end, his body began to fold and crumble as his size started to decrease, until he was nothing more than a weakened man of magma, bleeding across the battlefield. He looks up to the forces before him, cursing them all as he proclaims that if he cannot win this fight, then neither shall they. Retrieving a sword from a nearby fallen soldier, he made a beeline for one person in mind, Gastrolite, Echarnus' son. Fighting valiantly, Gastrolite had stunned not only Nadir, but everyone around him as he held his might against him. However, A slight mistake in his attack pattern led to Nadir slicing Gastrolite right across the eye as his blood stained the sword. Witnessing this, and before Nadir could retreat, a vengeful fueled Larnia had thrown herself against him, releasing her anger against him, as she almost proved too much for him, and indeed, if it were not for a piece of her armour had fallen from her leg, that allowed for Nadir to plunge his sword deep within her thigh, she too had fallen to the ground, wincing in pain. And with this, Nadir used his remaining strength to retreat back to the fortress underground. The kings and queens rushed over to the two wounded warriors as small pools of blood began pouring from their wounds.